Good day. Today is Tuesday, 13th May 2025, and lots of things continue to happen in the world. Donald Trump, for example, is currently in Saudi Arabia, where he's being received by King Salman and by the Crown Prince and de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, MBS, who I think Donald Trump counts as a personal friend. And other things are taking place also in many other places in the world too. But in this program, I will again focus on the situation and the conflict in Ukraine, because though the situation in the conflicts in the Middle East remains much more tragic, with far more people dying, it remains the case, in my opinion, that the conflict in Ukraine remains the most important geopolitical conflict. It is the most important in terms of the direction of international relations and the shift in the international balance of power. Anyway, I am going to quickly say that over the last 24 hours, we have moved in one respect in the Ukrainian conflict from low comedy to absolutely hopeless, ridiculous farce. So where are we? Well, yesterday when I made my program, it appeared that the Europeans were going to ignore the warning, the comments of Donald Trump about Ukraine going to Istanbul and working with the Russians to agreeing to the Russian proposal, to President Putin's proposal for direct negotiations. Zelensky had suggested that he might go himself, but it seemed to me yesterday that he was making that conditional on the Russians first agreeing to a ceasefire, which they have, of course, already refused to do. And as I discussed yesterday in my program, the British Foreign Minister, David Lammy, telephoned Marco Rubio, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and it appeared that the US was still committed to the agreed position that the Western powers had reached over the course of the four European leaders, Macron, Starmer, Merz and Tusk's visit on Saturday to Kiev, the agreement that they had reached, that if the Russians didn't agree to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire on Monday, then the Western powers would collectively move forward with the sanctions, the massive sanctions that President Macron of France and others have been talking about. Anyway, that is how the situation looked to me to be yesterday. And we were getting comments from European officials, from Merz's spokesman, that the clock was ticking. There were only 12 hours left before the deadline set out in the ultimatum on Monday expired, that unless the Russians use that time, those 12 hours, to declare the ceasefire, the sanctions would follow. And anyway, that seemed to be the position. And then, of course, we got more comments from President Trump, and going even further against the stated positions of his foreign policy people, Kellogg and Rubio. He went on to say that it was terribly important that this meeting in Istanbul between the Ukrainians and the Russians take place. He understood that the leaders, that's to say Putin and Zelensky, would be attending. He was actually, I think, as of the time that he said that, wrong in thinking this. Putin has never said that he is going to Istanbul on Thursday, and as we will see shortly, that doesn't seem to be his intention at all. As for Zelensky, as of the time when Trump spoke, it still seems to me that Zelensky's actual position was that he would not go to Istanbul unless the Russians agreed to a ceasefire. But anyway, Trump appears to have convinced himself, or misunderstood, or assumed that a summit meeting between Putin and Zelensky would probably happen in Istanbul on Thursday. He said this would be a wonderful and very good thing, that it would move things forward and that there might be peace. And he said that he was seriously thinking about going to Istanbul himself so that he could attend this summit meeting, though it would be very difficult for him to do that because he had so many meetings ahead of him in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, where he's also due to go, and who gifted him a luxuriously outfitted Boeing 747, which could replace Air Force One. Anyway, just to say. Anyway, nonetheless, despite all of that, despite all of these other pressing engagements, Donald Trump spoke about the fact that he might want to come to Istanbul himself to participate in the negotiations. So, after Trump said that, it became absolutely clear to the Europeans, however angry they already were with Trump's previous comments welcoming the Russian proposal for negotiations in Istanbul. However angry they previously were, it became absolutely clear that Trump was sticking to his position that he welcomed the meeting in Istanbul. He wasn't really thinking at that time about imposing sanctions at all, and that his priority was to see this meeting in Istanbul take place. And, well, if you were following the news as closely as I was following it yesterday, it became very obvious that the entire European position yesterday began to disintegrate. A meeting did take place, an EU meeting did take place. I am not exactly sure at what level. It turned out that many EU states had not been briefed in advance about any further plan to impose sanctions on Russia over and above the 17th sanctions package, which is already being under discussion. That package, by the way, seems to mostly target Russia's so-called shadow fleet. Just saying. Anyway, many EU countries asked, what was all this about? What was this ultimatum that was delivered to the Russians on Saturday? Why weren't they told about it in advance? What sanctions was it that Macron exactly had in mind? And, well, it turned out that Macron and the rest had actually no further sanctions proposals to present to this meeting. So this whole meeting basically collapsed in confusion. And, of course, it turned out that the Americans at that point, after Trump's various comments, were not moving forward with sanctions, with further sanctions anyway. Moreover, Trump has now made it crystal clear that he does expect the Ukrainians to go to Istanbul on Thursday. In fact, he absolutely categorically insists on it. He doesn't care whether or not there is a ceasefire before the meeting. He's going to react very badly, or so the Europeans and the Ukrainians fear, if the Ukrainians do not go to Istanbul. To repeat again, up to Donald Trump making those comments, the position, Zelensky's position, as far as I can understand it, is that he was not going to go to Istanbul unless the Russians agreed to a ceasefire. So even though he was talking about going to Istanbul, it was more a rhetorical position than an actual one. It was intended to somehow divert attention away from Putin's offer of direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul on Thursday. Anyway, the Europeans, the Ukrainians now find themselves facing absolute categorical demands from Donald Trump that they do indeed go to Istanbul on Thursday. And according to Bloomberg, the Europeans have been anxiously contacting the Americans to find out whether, after the talks in Istanbul on Thursday, assuming they take place, if there is still no ceasefire after the talks, whether at that point the Americans would be willing to go ahead with further massive sanctions against Russia. And apparently, the Europeans are not getting any response from the Americans. The Americans are not saying one way or the other. That is probably because the people in the State Department, Marco Rubio and his officials, who are the people that the Europeans are probably in touch with, genuinely do not know. They don't know what is in Donald Trump's mind. Kellogg and Rubio had spoken as if the United States would be announcing sanctions in unison with the Europeans on Monday, unless the Russians agreed to a 30-day ceasefire. Since Trump has essentially put a line through all of that, they don't know what he intends to do if the talks do take place on Thursday, but there is still no ceasefire. So they're not able to say. And so there is complete confusion. And I understand it. The confusion goes on. So, I was reading in, I think it was the London Times, or it might have been the Daily Telegraph, that the Europeans are now reconciled to the fact that there has to be some kind of meeting in Istanbul, or at least some kind of Ukrainian presence in Istanbul on Thursday, in light of Trump's comments, and that they're trying to send their own people to Istanbul, people from Germany, France, Britain, to try to help the Ukrainians negotiate with the Russians, because they're worried about the Ukrainians negotiating by themselves. And apparently they all expect Zelensky himself to go to Istanbul on Thursday, even if there is no ceasefire. And it's quite clear that they're all telling Zelensky that, having now broached the idea of his going to Istanbul on Thursday, he must indeed go, in light of what Donald Trump has been saying. Well, Zelensky now finds that he is expected to go to Istanbul, but, as I said previously, it seems to me that his original proposal of going to Istanbul was not intended seriously. Now he is expected to go. And so we've had further comments and statements coming from Kiev, not so much from Zelensky himself, but from his various officials, from Podolyak and Yermak, that yes, indeed, Zelensky will go to Istanbul on Thursday, but if Putin doesn't come, even if there is an extremely strong Russian delegation in Istanbul, even if the Russians come and are ready to sit down and to negotiate with him, and there's no reason, by the way, why the Russians wouldn't negotiate with Zelensky. Anyway, even if they do come, but come without Putin, then Zelensky will not speak to them. He will walk out, and the Russians will be left in Istanbul, and Zelensky himself will fly to Ukraine. And I've been reading, again in the British media, that his aides, Podolyak, Yermak and the others, are now putting it out that there is no point in the great and wise President Zelensky meeting with Vladimir Putin's underlings in Istanbul, even if they be people like the Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, because it will be a complete waste of time. The only person, supposedly, who's able to make a decision would be Putin himself, and given that that is so, there's no point in wasting time talking to the hired help. This is how they talk about the government of Russia. Just saying. Well, of course, that is absolute and complete nonsense. Negotiating teams regularly meet. They remain accountable and responsible to their seniors in the respective capitals. They negotiate, they discuss things with each other, they make progress, they iron out many of the issues, they report back to their home governments, and then after they've reported back to their home governments, they receive instructions, and then the negotiations continue and make progress that way. That is the conventional way of conducting negotiations. Eventually, as the negotiations move forward, as the negotiations progress, as the position of the parties converges, and as they come closer to each other, and as a consensus between them starts to emerge, well, all sorts of things become possible. An entirely normal approach, normal course, would be for the negotiators to agree on most of the topics in contention, 95% or something like that. The most difficult matters remain unresolved. It's agreed that the leaders should then meet in an actual summit meeting, and then the two leaders can talk about these remaining unresolved issues with each other and see whether they can come to an agreement between them about them. That is the normal way of conducting negotiations at an international level. A situation where the leaders meet before anything has been agreed at all, when the parties actually disagree about absolutely everything, about ceasefires, about Ukraine's NATO membership, about the size of the Ukrainian armed forces, about the territories, about any one of those things. A meeting in which the leaders meet and talk about these things with each other without, as I said, any movement or discussion in the negotiations at all is a complete waste of time. Ian Proud, on his blog, The Peacemonger, has written a good piece about this, and remember, he's a diplomat. I would also say, reinforcing a point that Ian Proud has made, that another reason for being very wary of having a meeting of this kind, a leaders' meeting of Putin and Zelensky in Istanbul, is that it is an absolute certainty, as night follows day, that Zelensky would use the meeting to grandstand and to try to put Putin in an awkward position. And why would the Russians want to agree to something like that? So, anyway, that's where we are at the moment. Nothing has been resolved. The sanctions that we were promised yesterday have not appeared. There is no agreement in the EU, in the European Union, about them. The Americans haven't decided whether they're actually going to go forward with sanctions at all. Zelensky, one moment he gives the impression that he's going to Istanbul, the next moment he isn't. Then he says he will, but he won't speak to anybody but Putin, even if Mishustin, the Prime Minister or someone like that, turns up. It is absolute, complete chaos. And I'm going to explain why. I don't think it's at all difficult to understand. The Ukrainians fundamentally do not want peace. They don't want a peace settlement with the Russians because they are losing the war, and they know that if there was a negotiation with the Russians, especially if the fighting continued, their hand would weaken every day, and if there was a final settlement, it would have to be a settlement in which they conceded to the Russians far more than they are prepared to do. Probably they're not especially keen on a ceasefire at all. After all, to repeat again, right up to February, Zelensky's position was that he wouldn't accept a ceasefire unless he got security guarantees from the United States. When ceasefires have been agreed, like the 30-day energy truce, he has simply ignored them. He has pretended to agree to them, but his military have continued to conduct operations striking the Russian energy system during them. So he's probably not keen on a real ceasefire either. He worries that if there is a ceasefire, there would be demands for elections, there would be political uncertainties in Ukraine itself, and he probably doesn't want to face that. So he's not keen on talks, he's not keen on a ceasefire, but he does want it to appear that if there are no talks and no ceasefire, that the blame lies with the Russians, not him. So he puts on these stunts, saying he's going to go to Istanbul to meet with Putin, except, of course, that he doesn't really intend to go to Istanbul and doesn't honestly expect to meet with Putin. Because, as I said, his entire objective is to throw the blame for the collapse of the entire peace process on the Russians and on Putin. And that's all there is on his side. And on the side of the Europeans, it isn't that different either. It is a matter of complete bafflement to me that the Europeans want the war to continue, despite the fact that Ukraine is clearly losing. But that, it seems, is the case. Probably they don't fully understand the extent to which Ukraine actually is losing. Most of the information about the state of the conflict they seem to get from the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians always put a massively optimistic spin on whatever is going on. So probably the Europeans believe that Ukraine's military situation is much stronger and more sound than it really is. I remember the shock and panic that spread right across Europe back in February last year when Avdiivka, the fortified town near Donetsk, fell. I suspect that the Europeans generally did not believe at that time that Avdiivka would fall. They assumed that it was so strongly fortified and so strongly defended that the Russians would not be able to capture it. So I think the Europeans probably don't understand how bad Ukraine's military situation is, but ultimately they're not interested in stopping the fighting. They're not interested even in a ceasefire, though that is what they constantly and incessantly talk about now. Bear in mind that until Donald Trump became president on the 30th of January, and until the Ukrainians agreed to the American demand for a 30-day ceasefire in March, no European leader that I can remember had ever suggested a ceasefire or a freezing of the conflict. In fact, whenever it was suggested, the other European leaders, not by any leader, by the way, but in the media, by officials, by occasional commentators, the media, the political class across Europe would round on any person who did suggest such a terrible thing, because, of course, agreeing to a ceasefire, accepting that the Russians would remain in occupation of territory in formerly eastern Ukraine, well, that was absolute anathema. So they don't really want a ceasefire. They certainly don't want talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians, which might end with a peace settlement which would look like a Russian victory. They too want to wreck the entire negotiating process initiated by the Americans, whilst making it appear to the Americans that it is the Russians who are to blame. The Ukrainians and the Europeans might have slightly divergent perspectives, but ultimately their objective is the same: to scotch any move towards negotiations, to prevent any steps towards a final, genuine resolution of the conflict. Even the ceasefire is an awkward thing for them, but they don't want to go openly against Donald Trump. They fear that if they do, Donald Trump will cut off military supplies and intelligence assistance to Ukraine. They also fear that Donald Trump will do something that the Europeans feel is even more alarming and ultimately dangerous towards them, which is seek a full political, diplomatic and economic rapprochement with Russia. That has to be avoided at all costs. So they don't want to just wreck the talks. They want to wreck the talks in a way that the blame falls not on them, but on the Russians. And that's what this is all about. So you have the stunt of the four leaders going to Kiev. There's no reason why those leaders needed to go to Kiev at all. Just saying. I mean, obviously, there were the Victory Day celebrations in Moscow the following day. Zelensky was keen to some extent to draw attention away from those Victory Day celebrations. By the way, that was a dismal fail, if that was the intention. I don't think anybody looking at those four leaders in Kiev, huddled together, looking at times depressed and tired, sometimes putting on fake smiles and all of that, would seriously compare this dismal display with the pomp and circumstance and all of that that was happening in Moscow. But anyway, partly it was the intention was to draw attention away from what was happening in Moscow. But mostly it was to wreck the peace talks, to wreck the peace initiative that Trump has initiated, and to try to lock the United States back into the conflict, to give unstinting military, political, and economic support to Ukraine. Not because I think that the Europeans seriously any longer believe that Ukraine is going to win. They may think that it's in much better shape than it really is, but I think even they collectively understand that Ukraine isn't going to win the war. But to prevent the absolute nightmare of a rapprochement between the United States and Russia, which would leave those leaders high and dry, and which would provoke a split within the European Union. So that was the entire purpose of the exercise. There is no sincerity or honesty behind it. There is no real attempt to agree a ceasefire. As I said, nobody was talking about a ceasefire in Europe or in Ukraine before March. There is no real desire, there is absolutely no desire for serious negotiations with the Russians. If there was a desire for serious negotiations with the Russians, the Europeans would be taking Zelensky to one side and say to them, are you out of your senses? Do you really think that the way forward is for you to go to Istanbul and to refuse to talk to anybody there apart from Putin? You must put together a proper negotiating team, properly accredited with all of the correct mandates. That means rescinding your October 2022 decree, which prohibits negotiations with the Russians, and you must then sit down with the Russians and engage in serious negotiations and come to an agreement with them on the way forward to end the war. If the Europeans were serious about ending the war, that is what they would do. If the Ukrainians were serious about ending the war, that too is what they would do. But of course, instead, their plan is to wreck the entire peace process, blame the Russians for it, win over Donald Trump. It is duplicitous and manipulative and insincere, and as complicated plots of that kind often do, it's come unstuck, because it's ultimately difficult to continue to conduct a plot like that in full public view against individuals as unpredictable and as difficult to control as Donald Trump, or as thorough and methodical and as organized as the Russians. Anyway, where does all this leave us? I'm going to make a guess. I think in spite of everything now, Zelensky probably is going to go to Istanbul on Thursday. Earlier today, whilst we were doing a live stream, Alex and I, which you will find on the Duran, by the way, brilliant live stream, one of the participants in the live stream said that there'd been breaking news that Putin was not intending to go to Istanbul on Thursday, and that the Russian delegation to the talks on Thursday would be led by Lavrov and Ushakov. Now, I think that is very, very likely, but I have to say that some hours onward from that live stream, I've been checking the Russian media, and I have seen no announcement yet which confirms the makeup of the Russian delegation. So for the moment, it seems to me it's still somewhat up in the air, though I personally will be very surprised if Putin does go. I am confident that we will see a strong Russian delegation go to Istanbul. I think it is highly likely it will be led by Lavrov and Ushakov. I think that is the absolutely correct way to conduct negotiations at this time. As I've discussed, it is the conventional way to conduct negotiations at this time. And then, of course, if Zelensky is true to his word, he will flounce off to Kiev and refuse to meet with them. And then the big unanswered question again comes back to this. What in that event will Donald Trump do? Will he be angry because Putin didn't go to Istanbul? Will he feel angry that his own opportunity to meet with Putin in Istanbul, which is clearly something he hankers for, will not have been realized? His great moment as acting as the peacemaker. You can almost see the photos, at least the photos in Trump's mind, himself in the middle, Putin on one side, Zelensky on the other. He brings them both together, he gets them to shake hands, something of that kind. Anyway, will he be angry that that great photo op isn't going to happen? Or will he see through all of these maneuvers and intrigues that I've been setting out in this program? Will he realize that Zelensky is not in the slightest bit serious about negotiations with the Russians, that his announcement that he's going to Istanbul to meet with the Russians actually proves that he is not serious about negotiations with the Russians. And will Trump say to himself, and will Trump on behalf of the United States also say that enough is enough? Zelensky isn't interested in negotiations. Ukraine is not interested in negotiations. He's alluded to that possibility on his last Truth Social post, and that the time therefore has now finally come for the United States and for Donald Trump himself to walk away and to leave Ukraine and the Europeans to their own devices. Well, I am not holding my breath. I think I still have to say this. I still think that over the next couple of days, everybody who can in Washington, within the permanent bureaucracy, within the State Department, General Kellogg, will be working as hard as they can on Donald Trump to persuade him that it's the Russians who are not really being serious. They're not accepting his wonderful ceasefire plan, that the way to push them, break them into obedience is through sanctions, that there will be severe political risks for Donald Trump if he acted in any other way, that if he did that, he would find himself in conflict with people like Lindsey Graham in the Senate and the various army of senators that Lindsey Graham pretends or claims to have aligned behind him, and that given that it's the Russians who are not really being serious, Donald Trump should back Ukraine, order the sanctions, and recommit to Ukraine in the same way that Joe Biden did. Well, I have to say, I think that is the most likely outcome. But as of this moment in time, we simply don't know. Everything is up in the air. It could be, indeed it is highly likely, that between now and Thursday, all sorts of other diplomatic maneuvers and steps and things like that will happen, and we'll be seeing perhaps more proposals from the Russians, more proposals from the Americans, more shifting of the ground by the Europeans, and it could be that the situation will change all over again. Meanwhile, I should say that the Europeans continue to make their threats. The same German government spokesman who on Monday was telling us that the Russians had only 12 hours left in which to agree to an unconditional ceasefire or massive sanctions would follow, is saying today that unless the Russians negotiate seriously with the Ukrainians on Thursday, in other words, unless Putin comes and meets with Zelensky on Thursday, massive sanctions will follow. Just saying. And the German foreign minister, the new German foreign minister, who's replaced Annalena Baerbock, I'm afraid I can't remember his name, he is now also joining Keir Starmer and saying that Ukraine is on an irreversible path towards NATO, going directly against Donald Trump. And it's the kind of rhetoric which again undermines the prospect of negotiations in Istanbul. And I wonder whether it might, in fact, be intended to be so, whether the German leaders, whether the German government, whether Merz actually do want to undermine the negotiations and to put off the Russians, and whether that might explain these statements that the Germans, like the British, are now making. Well, I would say that others can see events as they're playing out. There was a meeting, I believe it was yesterday, between the leader of the Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen, and the Deputy Prime Minister of Italy, Matteo Salvini. The two came together and they both were very, very critical of the whole negotiating strategy, if you can dignify it with that word, that the European Union has been following. In fact, they spoke about a warmongering strategy. They made it absolutely clear that they completely disagree with what the EU leadership have been doing, and that they strongly disagree with the policies of President Macron of France in particular. Marine Le Pen, incidentally, said that if she is ever elected President of France, or if she's prevented from standing and another candidate backed by the Rassemblement National becomes President of France, the Franco-German axis that has dominated EU politics well since the 1970s will be severed, that it has become lopsided in favour of Germany and is become a pure mechanism to drive the process of European integration, of EU centralisation and integration against the wishes of the people of Europe and of most of the governments of the EU states. And that France will realign and seek to make common ground with Italy, which is France's most natural ally among the big countries of Europe. And Salvini, at least, seemed to share that view. Salvini, of course, is a rival with the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. They're not on especially friendly terms. And Le Pen also has not been on especially friendly terms with Meloni either until recently. But Le Pen seemed to think that Meloni's position was shifting, and she might, by the way, be right. Notice that Meloni did not join Starmer, Macron, Merz and Tusk on that trip to Kiev. She's not come out and given enthusiastic backing to this ultimatum that was announced on Thursday. She does seem to be quietly distancing herself from the whole enterprise. She's made clear that she opposes the deployment of European peacekeepers, as they still get called from time to time, to Ukraine. So it may be the case that Meloni is gradually shifting ground. Anyway, we shall see. But anyway, we can see that important people in France and Italy are coming out in opposition to this strategy and are making overtures to each other. And I, for one, would not be surprised if at some point in the next few years we did indeed start to see a kind of French-Italian entente start to appear within the EU to counter the influence both of Brussels and Berlin. Anyway, that's for the future, but clearly, as I said, Salvini and Le Pen are not impressed. Someone else who is not impressed either was Vladimir Putin. Now, he's not spoken very much about the Ukrainian conflict since he made his statement on Saturday, the one which, as I said, the single statement which has thrown the whole of Europe, the entire EU system, into complete confusion. But he did have a very interesting meeting today with certain prominent business leaders. This is a meeting devoted to further work on the Russian economy. There's an awful lot said about this meeting, about the state of the Russian economy altogether, and about Putin's plans for it, and that sort of thing. But he did turn briefly to the various talk about the sanctions, and he said some very interesting things about them. Somebody said to him that the Russians should not be worried about the sanctions, and he said this is Putin. First of all, he quoted what the other person said. He said, "We cannot be intimidated by these new possible sanctions," the sanctions that the Europeans and the Americans perhaps were talking about on Saturday. And Putin went on to say, "We must not be afraid. Whoever starts to be afraid will immediately lose everything. But it is absolutely necessary to understand what can happen, and we must be prepared for any actions of our possible future ill wishers. They do many things to their own detriment. It seems that they will definitely not do this or that because it harms them, and yet they will nonetheless do it. The idiots, excuse me, please." Now, that is the first time, as far as I'm aware, that Vladimir Putin has called the leaders of the West, or at least the leaders of Europe, idiots. That's his word. It's not mine. It's there in the Kremlin readout of his words. So he says we mustn't be scared about their sanctions. We must give no sense to them that we are scared about these sanctions. Obviously, we must prepare for them. We must do everything we can to be ready to deal with these sanctions. If they come, if they do come, the Europeans, will suffer more from them than we will, but that isn't going to deter them from pressing on with these sanctions, because these people are idiots. They are fools. So what else can you expect from them? And he went on to say, by the way, the world's leading economies are falling into recession just to harm us. I'll buy tickets. I won't go, they say, in order to spite the bus conductor. What is this? So, of course, we should keep this in mind, that they can do what they talk about publicly. And we, of course, must at least minimize the negative consequences for us. This is also the question of what is a self-sufficient economy. Everything is interconnected in the modern world. This is an obvious thing, but still there are key points that constitute one of the parameters of our economic independence and sovereignty. We must be ready for everything. So that's Putin. Very practical answer. And again, you see the mask slip a little, and you see the utter contempt in which he holds the leaders of Europe, and how he thinks that they are fools, and how he's basically losing patience with these people who he sees as fools. So I will just finish this discussion of the diplomacy, if you can call it diplomacy. As I said, it's too farcical, really, to call diplomacy, by making one very last observation. Yesterday, the media commentary was saying that the Europeans were furious with Donald Trump because they thought they had Putin cornered. And now, to their fury, after Putin's statement of Saturday and after Trump's interventions over the following days, it seems that Putin is not cornered in the way that they hoped. They are actually lying about this again. It is not Vladimir Putin that they're really trying to corner. The person they're trying to corner and he needs to understand this, is Donald Trump. They want to maneuver Trump into a position where he announces further sanctions against Russia and more economic and military support for Ukraine. They know that that is not what he really wants to do, but they are trying to maneuver him into a position where he has no political alternative other than to do it. That ultimately is what all of these maneuvers over the last couple of days are about. Now, I'm going to make here a guess. I am going to guess that the person whose mind is behind this strategy is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Keir Starmer himself. I say that, again, I think by now it's fairly obvious to anybody who follows these programs that I have no time at all for Keir Starmer, and I have to allow for that bias. But Starmer is first and foremost a lawyer. He worked in the courts for a very, very long time. He's a barrister. And I have to say that this sort of maneuver of trying to maneuver your adversary into a position where he takes steps which you can then say are unreasonable, these attempts, in other words, to score points off Putin, and these attempts also to box in Donald Trump, they all look to me to be very like the kind of courtroom tactics of a certain type that I do see play out, have seen at times play out in British courtrooms. As in so much else, it seems to me that Keir Starmer is unable to transcend his background. He's unable to think beyond what he already knows. He sticks to this approach, which may work in the courts, by the way, not nearly as well or as often as some people think. But it absolutely doesn't work in the world of diplomacy, certainly not against an adversary like Vladimir Putin. Now, as I've been making this program, I see that Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, has now made certain further comments of his own. He has said that Donald Trump has announced some kind of imposed some kind of ultimatum. The president has issued an ultimatum to both sides that without those direct talks, and if they don't occur quickly, then he believes the United States ought to step back from this conflict, whatever that means, and not be involved. This is something that we want to mediate. It's not our war. We didn't start the war, but we want to help to end it. The way that happens is a ceasefire, everybody stops the violence, and we spend a bit of time together making sure we can deal with the major issues here, and I think we can. If direct talks between Russia and Ukraine bring any result, there will be a strong chance of getting an end to this conflict. It's bad for the Europeans, it's bad for the Ukrainians. I don't think it's good for the Russians. Well, we've heard this so many times that unless there's direct talks or unless there's a ceasefire or unless there's progress, the United States will walk away. These ultimatums come from the administration at regular intervals. We've been hearing them for weeks now. We even had a brief moment when the State Department spokesman actually said that the United States had walked away from its so-called mediation efforts. But we see that whenever they say that, almost immediately they go back and they become involved. Anyway, we will see how this plays out. There's been more comments, incidentally, from Leonid Slutski, who's chairman of the State Duma Committee on International Affairs. He is scathing about Zelensky. He says on Thursday our negotiators will be in Istanbul, regardless of Kiev's stance, and they will be there. And this clearly shows that today we are materializing as the only genuine peace-oriented scheme which is proposed by our president. And that strongly suggests that Putin indeed is not going to go to Istanbul. And another Russian diplomat, Rodion Miroshnik, on television, Russia 24 television, has said, you know, when somebody says, let's just arrange a ceasefire and hope that the parties will not breach it, I don't believe that such stories will work with Ukraine, because in this case, the machine of data distortion comes into operation and some reports begin to be churned out and immediately sent to Washington, London, or some other place. Unfortunately, this machine works, which is why it is practically impossible to organize a steady ceasefire without a careful preparatory stage. A ceasefire is an instrument that must be built into a separate peace mechanism. This instrument by itself can't resolve the problem of achieving peace, and all the more so a sustainable peace, unfortunately. So it looks to me as if Putin is definitely not going to Istanbul, and as if, as I've said already, the Russian stance is not in substance changing. Anyway, let's move on, because I said earlier in the program that I don't think the Europeans fully understand quite how bad Ukraine's military position actually is. We've been through this before. Back in the summer of 2024, there was a whole narrative for a time about how the war was in stalemate. And then over the course of the summer, as the Russians advanced towards Pokrovsk and captured settlement after settlement and broke through one Ukrainian defense line after another, the mood began to shift and people in the West became increasingly more alarmed, until eventually the winter came, the cold weather and the Rasputitsa that came. The Russian advance slowed, though it never completely stopped. The narrative that the Russians were being held back by Ukraine's vast drone fleet then started to circulate. And you got a kind of sense that with Trump's peace efforts, the focus on what was actually going on the front lines was lost, and the Europeans fell back into complacency, assuming that Ukraine would be able to continue to hold out pretty much indefinitely. Well, as I've been saying for some time now, back in March, basically after the Russians drove the Ukrainians out of Kursk region, the Russians commenced their offensive. And it's important to say that, as with all Russian offensives, it's like one of those big moon rockets that NASA used to launch, Saturn V and all that. It appears to start quite slowly, but then it gathers power, and eventually it is moving at speeds which practically no other vehicle, human-created vehicle of the time, could hope to achieve. Well, we are now very much in that situation where the Russian offensive is indeed gathering more and more speed and more power. And as I have said, and as Russian officials have said, Andrei Marochko, for example, the thing that distinguishes this offensive, this year's offensive, from the offensive that we saw last year in the summer of 2024, dramatic though that 2024 offensive was, this offensive, this year's offensive, is one which is being conducted right across the entire contact line. Last year, it was mainly focused on Avdiivka, on the territory to the west of Avdiivka, all the way to Selidovo, Kurachovo, Ugledar, and ultimately Pokrovsk. This time, it's happening right across, it's extending right across the entire battlefront. And I should say that nowhere, not in any place, is there any sign of the Ukrainians successfully holding back the Russians for any length of time, or of the Ukrainians any longer succeeding in conducting counterattacks. Now, there are reports that not for the first time, the Ukrainians are now very, very short of artillery shells. This has been a recurring story in the war. They run very short of artillery shells. The Western powers cobble shells together. They send them a supply. The Ukrainians manage to stabilize the situation for a few weeks. Then they run out of those shells. The Russians, in the meantime, increase their shelling, and the Ukrainians are forced to fall back, and fall back badly because they can't withstand the shelling. Well, it looks as if that whole cycle is repeating itself, and the way it's playing out with the Russian advances happening at the present time, and with the increasingly heavy Russian shelling, and with the increasingly light Ukrainian shelling, it's starting to look to me as if the story that drones have successfully taken the place of artillery is being exposed as fundamentally false. Without strong artillery, Ukraine can't hold back the Russians. Drones can do a certain amount of damage, but they can't make up for the absence of artillery. And it is the absence of artillery and critical shortages of manpower which explain why the Russians, who have no shortage of manpower, equipment, or artillery, or indeed drones, are able to advance ever more strongly. Now, in my program yesterday, I said that there were reports that the Ukrainians had carried out a counterattack over the course of the Victory Day truce in Toretsk, and that it had ended in complete disaster, and that the Russians had lured the Ukrainian forces into Toretsk, and then the attack force that was lured into Toretsk was completely destroyed. Well, I also said that there were reports that Deep State, the Ukrainian mapping project, had confirmed that, but I hadn't actually managed to read those reports. Well, I have now done so, and they give a vivid account of an operation that failed, and failed hideously. I'm not going to read the report here, but this, as far as I can tell, was the last important attack that the Ukrainians have been able to make over the last couple of days. Everywhere else, even now on the territory of Kursk region, where the Ukrainians were for a time trying to capture the village of Totkino, they've been thrown back on the defensive. So let's do a quick rundown of where we stand. Firstly, this morning, reports were circulating across the internet, I can't confirm them, but I suspect that they're true, that the village, the strategically important village of Bagatir in southwest Donbass, has now fallen in its entirety to the Russians. Now, this would be a battle for this fortified village that has played out over just a couple of days. Now, I understand that Bagatir had a population before the war of about the same size as the village of Novomikhailovka, which the Russians fought something like 6 months to capture over the course of the winter of 23-24 and the early spring of 2024. Whereas Bagatir, it looks as if they've been able to capture in just a few days. Anyway, this capture does appear to open the way for the Russians to advance further westwards, ultimately towards the Dnieper, into Dnipro region. Their major objective in this part of the battlefront seems to be a village called Komar, which lies west of Bagatir and north of Velikaya Novosilka, which the Russians captured some months ago. And if Komar is captured, it's another logistics position that the Ukrainians have, and it opens the way for the Russians to advance into Dnipro region and potentially to the Dnieper itself. Anyway, those are the reports. We'll see whether they are true, whether Bagatir has indeed fallen. I saw telegram reports this morning from Ukrainian sources which admitted that Russian forces had captured the central area of Bagatir, but it could be that since those reports, the Russians have cleared the entire village. Anyway, further north, the Russians continue to hold their positions in the village of Zverove, just southwest of Pokrovsk. But perhaps more alarming for the Ukrainians, the Russians have now captured the village of Mirolyubivka, which lies to the east of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, south of the main road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. The Russians have captured villages like Vozvezhenka, Yelizavetivka. They are apparently attacking another village called Malinivka, with Mirolyubivka under Russian control. There are two small villages, Mirny and Nikolaevka, left, and then there's the more important village of Novoekonomichny, and then essentially the Russians have encircled Pokrovsk from the east and are in a strong position to cut off Ukrainian supply lines to Pokrovsk from the north. Now, the Russians are saying that the fall of Mirolyubivka opens the way for the attack on Pokrovsk. And it's our old friend, Andrei Marochko, and he's told TASS the seizure of the settlement of Mirolyubivka opens operational space, in particular in the direction of Mirnograd. This is the city, the town, the suburb, the eastern suburb of Pokrovsk, which is located close to Pokrovsk. So that is what Marochko is saying. It is increasingly my belief that the Battle of Pokrovsk is going to begin in earnest this month. And, well, that's Pokrovsk. Elsewhere, for the Ukrainians, things also are going very badly. There's been a lot of reports about the situation in the area south of Konstantinovka. A Ukrainian analyst, I'm taking this, by the way, from Simplikis the Thinker, but he's got a summary of some comments that have been said by several Ukrainian analysts. He's saying, this Ukrainian analyst, Maroshnikov, says the enemy is already approaching the approaches to Konstantinovka from the southwest. That's only on one side, but in the summer it will be much more convenient for the enemy to conduct a general occupation here. Nobody thinks the enemy will stop or make a deal. They will attack and attack en masse, and Konstantinovka, Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, and towards the Oskol in the estuary direction, and towards Drushkivka and Chasov Yar. Only the armed forces of Ukraine can stop this. We're now hostage to Trump's reluctance to provide us with new aid. And, well, that's what he thinks. He seems to think that the situation is getting worse. And, in fact, there have been many reports from this area, and they all seem to suggest that the situation is indeed getting a lot worse. Now, yesterday, Redovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, also gave a summary of the fighting in this area south of Konstantinovka, and I came away with the understanding after reading their report that the Russians have indeed now captured the central area of Chasov Yar. There's only certain outlying micro-districts left. Now, Redovka is very well informed. It is not always 100% reliable, and it may also be that there's a translation error. But I have wondered whether Russian advances north of Chasov Yar might mean that the central high-rise building area, the so-called citadel area, has fallen to the Russians, and the Redovka report might suggest that it has done. Anyway, all this is very dramatic and very important. Perhaps the most dramatic news, however, is coming from the area of Liman. There are apparently confirmed reports that the Russians have now entered the village of Kolodyazi, which is located 11 kilometers north of Liman, and that they have also begun to storm another village called Ritko Dub, which is located north of Liman, but which is often seen as essential for Liman's defense. If Kolodyazi and Ritko Dub fall, and everybody assumes that they will, then most assume that the fall of Liman, the third fall of Liman in this conflict, the first was when it was captured by the Russians in, I believe it was May 2022. The second was when it was recaptured by the Ukrainians in, I believe, October 2022. The third capture of Liman, which will be the last capture of Liman in this war, may be coming very soon. It may soon be upon us. Anyway, there's been more information about further fighting to the north in places like near Kupiansk. The Russians continue to advance beyond Kamienka, which they captured a short time ago. There's been reports that the Russians are now approaching the eastern outskirts of the town of Siversk. Anyway, there's been lots of reports about this, but given the length of the front lines, it would probably take me at least an hour to give a detailed account of what is happening. All I would say is the Russian offensive is gathering speed. It is advancing faster and faster. And to say it straightforwardly, I don't get the sense that the Ukrainians are defending very successfully in any place anymore. Anyway, I'm going to finish this program by touching on an important point about the China-US tariff reduction agreement. I've already said that, in my opinion, this was a win on points for China. The Americans have brought down their tariffs on Chinese goods to 30%, which is less than the tariffs were on before Liberation Day, when Trump announced tariffs against China on Liberation Day. The tariffs went up to 54%. They're now 30%. And notice that there's been significant carve-outs and exemptions from some categories of Chinese goods, which are no longer affected even by these 30% tariffs. But I've also said that I think that this was absolutely the correct thing for the US administration to do. And I should also say that it seems to me that here Trump and his people have pulled this off with some skill, even though the US has to some extent climbed down. It has managed to avoid, the Trump administration has managed to avoid any kind of political damage. And, well, it all seems to me to show that the administration is successfully digging itself out of the hole with China that it had dug itself into. But this is the key thing I want to say. The United States has now had to pull back on tariffs with China. There's been a lot of talk about secondary sanctions on countries that buy Russian oil. Is the United States, I discussed this in my program yesterday, going to reverse this agreement it's just reached with China to reduce tariffs because the Chinese continue to buy Russian oil and gas? Well, of course not. So the whole idea of secondary tariffs on Russian oil and gas is gone. By the way, the same is true of the whole idea of secondary tariffs or sanctions on countries that buy Iranian oil. China buys lots of Iranian oil. President Trump wrote an angry comment on Truth Social about a week ago saying that any country that buys Iranian oil can no longer do business with the United States. No actual tariff or sanctions announcements followed that comment. China, as far as I know, continues to buy Iranian oil, and nobody seriously believes that the United States is going to reverse the decision it has just made and stop trade with China. So this whole idea of secondary sanctions and tariffs on China, on Russia really, it is now dead. I've been reading absurd suggestions about what further sanctions on Russia might be, given that secondary sanctions really are not a practical idea anymore. I read a suggestion that the European Union might actually formally sanction Nord Stream 2. I mean, if that really does happen, if that is the plan, then all I can say is that the lunatics have indeed taken over the asylum, because in that case the EU would be sanctioning a pipeline that no longer exists. Just saying, it's been blown up. Well, there is one pipe, admittedly, but anyway, it's not functioning. I mean, it seems most bizarre. But the big, massive, bone-crunching sanctions that Lindsey Graham has been talking about, are hardly a viable proposition anymore. There continues to be a narrative that because of these sanctions, Russia is going to be prevented from developing its technologies. It's going to lapse into long-term scientific and technological stagnation. Now, firstly, that massively underestimates Russia's own very considerable, to say the least, scientific and technological resources. The Soviet Union, after all, was a scientific colossus and a technological colossus. Russia is not as big as the Soviet Union was, but it's big enough, and it's retained most of the Soviet Union's technological and scientific skills, and it's built up and improved on them. And personally, I think the Russians will be able to successfully match the West in most scientific and technological areas. But that's my belief. The Russians now have a secure trading and economic relationship with China. In economic terms, a much bigger country than they are themselves, and a country which everybody today now acknowledges is a scientific and technological colossus. I have been reading an article recently, it was on, I think it was in Unheard, that China now probably leads the United States in AI, and that they are very, very close now to developing their own chip industry to produce the high-end chips that up to now only Taiwan has been producing. Russia will be able to tap in to that technology. Chinese AI technology, Chinese chips, assuming it really isn't able to make advanced chips and AI technology of its own, which I believe it will and can. Now, surely this also says that the whole idea of sanctions, further sanctions on Russia to suffocate its economy, is now an exercise in complete futility. It's not smashed the Russians. It's not led to a financial crisis in Russia. The Russian economy continues to grow, not as fast as it did last year, when, according to the Russians, GDP growth was 4.3%, but it still seems to be above 2% at the moment. And the economics ministry believes that growth this year will be 2.5% and will start to rise later in later years, once this period of slightly slower growth is past. So the next suggestion that Russia faces long-term scientific technological stagnation, that can't really work either. So what ultimately are these sanctions for? If you can't defeat the Russians on the battlefields of Ukraine, and it must be obvious by now that you can't, if you can't break them economically, and you can't do that, if you can't suffocate their economy to prevent them developing advanced technologies, and as I said, there's no chance of that anymore, what's the point? Isn't it better to deal with the Russians now and to accept their terms, which will at least preserve a Ukraine without Crimea, shorn of the four regions, outside NATO, with reduced armed forces, but still a Ukraine which might have a viable future, in which its people would enjoy peace and might achieve economic prosperity over time? Is that not a much more realistic, far more humane approach than wasting time in these complex intrigues, trying to corner Putin when you're really trying to corner Trump, trying to impose bone-crunching sanctions on the Russians, which aren't going to succeed, stripping yourself of more and more weapons in order to stop a Russian offensive, which Pentagon officials are comparing to a lava flow, which simply cannot be stopped. Supporting a president in Ukraine who is an eccentric and whose only ideas are to throw stunts like the suggestion that he should go to Istanbul. Isn't it hard, long, beyond time, when our leaders finally grew up and started to do serious things for the people of Ukraine, for the people of Europe, for the United States, for humanity as a whole? Well, I ask these questions. I don't expect anybody is listening. Anybody important is listening. Certainly not anybody from my government. But anyway, I think they are questions that should be posed. This is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.